Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Harvard Art Museums. I'm Cassandra Albinson, Curator of European Paintings and Sculpture here at the museum, and I'm pleased to welcome you for this program about Jean-Honoré Fragonard's painting, Young Girl Reading, which you can see on the screen. The painting is here at Harvard through September 11th on loan from the National Gallery in Washington. It complements our strong holdings of Fragonard, and already having Young Girl Reading here has been a stimulus for deeper conversation about our painting, but also about the holdings of drawings by Fragonard that we have in the collection, and prints as well. And in our second floor galleries, if you go up to see the painting, you can also see a group of drawings by Fragonard that were selected by my colleague Edouard Kopp, the Maida and George Abrams Curator of Drawings, and you can see those alongside the painting upstairs. I thought, and Edouard thought, as we were talking about this program and thinking about it, that it would be fruitful today to hear from several speakers about this important painting. So after I give some remarks, you'll hear first from Yuriko Jackall, a specialist in 18th century French painting. Yuriko is assistant curator of French paintings at the National Gallery in Washington, so she looks after this painting 24/7, except when it's here at Harvard. She's a very lucky curator. Yuriko has curated the upcoming exhibition called Fragonard's Fantasy Figures, which will open in Washington on October the 8th. So that's October of this year, so please go to Washington and see the exhibition. After Yuriko's talk, we'll hear from Marika Knowles. Marika studies French art of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and she's currently a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows, which is the most prestigious award that Harvard gives to young scholars. And after these talks, there will be time for discussion about the painting and about some of the issues that we've spoken about today, and that discussion will be moderated by Edouard. We at the Harvard Art Museums are very pleased to have Yuriko and Marika with us, and I want to thank you both personally for your participation. I also want to thank the Division of Academic and Public Programs here at the museum. I want to thank Edouard for his collaboration and collegiality regarding the loan and the program. I want to thank Eunice Williams for sharing her knowledge of Fragonard with me, and I want to thank Heather Linton for her advice and support for this event. Today's program is supported by the Robert and Margaret Rothschild Lecture Fund at the Harvard Art Museums. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Fragonard's career and talk to you about some of my ideas about the painting that have developed as I've had the opportunity to live with it for the past month and a half. Born in the south of France, Fragonard went to Paris at the age of 8 to train as a painter. He was the last major artist associated with the French rococo, which flourished in France from around 1700 to 1789. What set Fragonard apart, particularly from his teacher, Francois Boucher, was his interest in representing aspects of contemporary life and contemporary morals, and we'll talk a little bit about that this afternoon. After training with Boucher, Fragonard won the Prix de Rome, which allowed him to travel and study in Italy. In 1761, he was welcomed home to Paris as the new hope for the French School of Painting. And 4 years later, Fragonard was provisionally welcomed into the Academy on the strength of an operatic scene, a painted scene, which we'll see later, I think, in one of the talks, that showed a poet committing suicide as a means of saving his beloved. So this was a very amazing, kind of over-the-top history painting. The painting was purchased by the state, but from that time forward, for reasons that are not fully understood by scholars, Fragonard rarely exhibited his works publicly. So after this initial success with this history painting, and he chose not to progress into full membership at the Academy, but instead worked for wealthy private patrons. And at this juncture, Fragonard began creating works like the Swing, which I'm showing you here from the Wallace collection in London. The Swing was commissioned by a baron, so one of these sort of aristocratic and wealthy patrons that Fragonard worked for, who wished to see his mistress being pushed on a swing by a bishop. Yeah, I mean, we talk about this as a completely normal thing for someone to commission a painting of. It's actually quite interesting. So he wanted to see his mistress being pushed on a swing by a bishop while he, the baron, looked on. And you can see him down here in the foliage. Her hat flaps in the breeze, and one delicate pink shoe has flown off as she's swinging. You can see that there. The Baron seems almost able to reach out of the foliage and grab her stockinged foot. Or perhaps the statue of Cupid on the far left will snatch it, for the stone figure seems to be almost alive. You can see him putting his finger to his lip. A little bit of, to kind of keep things secret. This painting is about motion, danger, and pleasure. I think the feeling that you get is that the young woman might very well plunge off of the swing, just as she might give herself up to either of these potential lovers, suspended as she is in the air between them. Because Fragonard rarely exhibited his works, there is a lack of information about parts of his practice, and even the basic chronology of his career is a bit unclear. But it's important to remember that most artists of the time, Fragonard included, usually didn't date their paintings. In 1769, however, Fragonard did write the date, so he wrote 1769 on one of a group of works that we now know as his fantasy figures. And so scholars believe that it was around this time that he created this series of works, including Young Girl Reading. I'm showing you Head of an Old Man by Fragonard on the left, which is in a museum in Paris now. It shares many characteristics with the fantasy figures that we'll be talking about more today. The man wears a costume that his contemporaries would have regarded as anachronistic, with its turned-up collar and gold-braided trim. The fanciful nature of this costume, I think, is signaled even more strongly by the medallion on his chest that you can see here emblazoned with an F for Fragonard. In a true portrait, the balance of power hovers between the sitter who has commissioned the work and the artist who then works to create that portrait. The artist of a more traditional portrait might embellish it in many ways and bring their own concerns to bear, certainly. But one important job they did have to do was to respond to the sitter's desire to be painted in a certain way. Hence, there's always a set of negotiations between artist and sitter about how the finished portrait will look. Here, what's interesting to me is that Fragonard has literally pinned his own name on the sitter's chest, making the old man, I think, quite clearly an emblem of the artist's power, I would say, more than a representation of an individual person. This man was painted to serve as a tool for Fragonard's exuberant brushwork, and I think this is something to keep in mind as we look at some of the other fantasy figures. But I think to understand Fragonard's fantasy figures, it helps to compare this one in particular to the painting by Rembrandt on the right of the slide, The Head of an Old Man, which is in Harvard's collection and is upstairs as well. Fragonard was looking at this tradition from the history of art in which an artist focused on the physical aspects of the sitter and used that appearance to suggest a larger meaning. The Rembrandt also was probably painted from a real sitter, but it was not a traditional portrait. And paintings of aged men and women were particularly popular in this guise because their appearance, when presented in certain settings, suggested ideas like wisdom and longevity, just as an image of a young girl could conjure associations of innocence and purity. During the period that Fragonard made the paintings we call the fantasy figures, there were a lot of changes happening in his own life. His teacher, Boucher, died, and Fragonard also married a woman named Anne-Marie Gérard. Anne-Marie's sister, Marguerite, came into the household soon after as a student of Fragonard, so in around 1775. So this was really a household and a studio full of women, especially as Fragonard's daughter, Rosalie, was born not long after her parents' marriage. Both Marianne and Marguerite were artists, as I mentioned, but Fragonard doesn't depict them painting or drawing, although we know that certainly they did a lot of this because a lot of their work survives. And in fact, upstairs, we have a painting that was done by Marguerite Gérard and Fragonard together. So they sometimes worked on paintings together later in her career. What's interesting to me in terms of thinking about the young girl reading is that the Gérard sisters were shown several times by Fragonard, not painting but reading. And here I'm showing you a drawing that's at the National Gallery in Washington, which some scholars think depicts the sisters. Now I want to compare this drawing with a painting by Boucher, and that's the painting on the left. This is Fragonard's master, and he depicted his wife in sensual splendor in her boudoir. And you can see, I hope you can see that in the Fragonard drawing, there's a book here. In the Boucher, there is no book, but instead a letter here. And I think that letter, to me, suggests a missive from a lover rather than sort of literary concerns that you're seeing in the drawing here. Fragonard's image of women in the middle-class home is much closer, I would argue, to what we think of as a sort of Victorianized vision of the angel in the house. The two women in the drawing sit before what appears to be a chest of drawers or a fireplace, and they concentrate on reading or listening rather than displaying themselves for the viewer. The domestic sphere for Fragonard seems to have been about women in intimate, almost simple, and certainly not opulent or sensual surroundings, and it's focused on the act of reading a book. So here's the painting we've been talking about, Young Girl Reading. And when Young Girl Reading was sold at auction in 1776, the catalog described it as follows. A young woman sits near a window. She is leaning against a cushion and holds a book that seems to occupy her. The idea of the book as occupying the attention of the sitter links Young Girl Reading with important scholarship on 18th century paintings by the art historian Michael Fried. Fried has argued that images of subjects in states of inwardness, what he calls absorption, or self-forgetfulness, as another critic puts it, and I think this is a helpful term by someone who's reading Fried for thinking about what he's talking about here, this kind of self-forgetfulness and focus on the task at hand, in this case, the reading of the text, was, according to Fried, critical to the move away from the theatrical rococo aesthetic of the kind we saw in the Boucher just a moment ago. For Fried, Fragonard is really the key bridge figure between rococo and neoclassical painting, which he sees as more serious and self-contained. Even before the 18th century, however, there was a tradition in Western art of depicting women reading. When he was in Rome for the first time, Fragonard copied the figure of the Erythraean Sibyl from the Sistine ceiling, and I'm showing you that. That's the figure on the far left here. We see this figure as rendered by Fragonard, and then I'm showing you a beautiful 18th century print from our collection with from a larger portion of the Sistine ceiling, so you can get a sense of where that figure sits. The Sibyls were prophetesses who were said to have foretold the birth of Christ, and their most important, aside from this position of reading, is the book here that appears as a symbol of their erudition. Before the end of the 17th century, images of women readers were often confined to these kinds of images, and then also to images with religious themes. Here I'm showing you a painting by a Spanish artist around the circle of Zurbarán of the young virgin who's dropped off to sleep while reading and studying. So-called education of the virgin scenes often depicted Mary being taught by her mother, but sometimes too she was shown alone, as we see here, in a painting that echoes in mood, iconography, and concerns, things that Fragonard picks up on in his Young Girl Reading. From around 1700, the genre of paintings of women reading alone took off in popularity. Printing, and consequently books, became more inexpensive and therefore more widespread at this time. Also, fiction, at least in France and England, in the form of the novel, became more popular. The novel was seen as a way of sparking emotion, but also as a means of modeling morals and values. Conduct books, which discussed comportment and behavior, were also popular, and as were religious tracts. There was also a growth in erotic literature. One of the central concerns of the age in the 18th century, in Europe certainly, was that women and the young would be exposed through literature to coarsening ideas that could lead them down a path to what some considered bad behavior. Artists such as Fragonard's contemporary and fellow Boucher student, Pierre-Antoine Baudon, created paintings such as this one called The Reader, which, as you can see, depicts a woman who's probably masturbating, presumably from having read something titillating in the book that's fallen out of her left hand. And this is something important to keep in mind, that these are other types of images of women reading that were circulating in this period. It's interesting to me, though, that Fragonard, for all his paintings and drawings of scenes of sexual license, and he did paint many, and I'm going to show you some here just to give you a sense of the other kinds of moods he could create in his paintings, didn't include books in these kinds of scenes. These bedroom scenes, where one might expect to find a book of erotic literature as a stimulus for desire, have none. In Fragonard's work, books appear instead in images of domestic contentment, like the drawing I showed you before. And these very different works seem to equate the consumption of literature with familial bliss rather than erotic bliss. For many years, Fragonard was considered by scholars to be nearly illiterate. But in fact, he must have read widely, for in the last decade of his career, he was devoted to making drawings for book illustrations, some done for publishers, but others seemingly done for his own pleasure. And this allocation of time and resources suggests that Fragonard valued literature and understood it quite deeply. The heightened and intensified feelings brought about by the consumption of literature in the 18th century was equated not only with eroticism, like in the image that I showed you a moment ago, but also with a trait known as sensibility. Cultivation of this trait of sensibility came not from urbane pleasures, but from private retreat. Anthony Wall, who's written a book on images of women in 18th century French art, notes that it was often the wives of artists or their close family members who were depicted reading. And reading was thought to be one of these key things that would build up sensibility, a sort of ultra-sensitivity to the plight of others and the understanding of other people's experiences in the world, which was seen as a positive trait in the 18th century, and hopefully still is today. We could talk about that later, though. Reading was really seen as a major avenue of self-improvement, and one that often took place within the domestic sphere. But because of that double-edged sword of women's reading, so what we saw in the image by Baudouin, that it could suggest possible sexual arousal or licentiousness, male artists often depicted the women closest to them as conspicuously innocent readers. So here I'm showing you again the young girl reading, and then on the right is a portrait by the British artist Joshua Reynolds of his beloved niece, Theophilia Palmer. In this case, so in the Reynolds painting on the right, we can see the title on the book's spine. It reads Clarissa. This is to indicate that she's reading the famous Jonathan Richardson's best-selling book, Clarissa Harlowe, which was published in 1784 in English and 1751 in France, and really took the entire continent of Europe and the New World by storm in many ways. It was an epistolatory novel, or a novel of letters, and it tells the story of the eponymous heroine who elopes with her lover and then unfortunately dies of shame. Fragonard very consciously doesn't show us the text on the page in the young girl reading as anything that's legible, and that's quite interesting to me too, those gray lines, even though he's opening up the book to show us the pages, but we can't read what she's reading. So there really are myriad possibilities as to what the young girl could be reading. What we can see clearly is that the book that she holds is small, smaller than that in the Reynolds portrait. Fragonard's sitter easily holds this, what would have been called a pocket book, or a book small enough to go into your pocket. And women's clothing at this point, which must have been really fantastic, always had pockets in it. So these books could be slipped into the pocket. And as you can see, she can hold it easily in one hand and hold the pages open just with 2 fingers. So I want to end by comparing young girl reading with another painting by Fragonard. The woman's exposed breast and fanciful costume of pink silk and pearls in the painting on the right, as well as the oil lamp, which is a sort of archaic or old-fashioned accessory, suggests that this is an allegorical image meant to invest its female sitter with larger symbolic meaning. Her direct gaze and her focused and direct gaze on the text on the right, so here, as well as the lamp, which would have allowed her to read late into the night, so continue her studying and concentration, both suggest sustained attention. There are other similarities to the young girl reading, including the profile pose, which is quite unusual, and also the curled fingers and the focus on the exposed neck and ear was something that I thought was an interesting comparison between these two. The painting on the right is today called Allegory of Vigilance. And this figure of Vigilance's left hand, absent-mindedly, as you can see, plays with her, plays against her neck in an autoerotic way. This detail, and thinking about this, made me go back and examine young girl reading differently. Her left arm, as you can see here, rests on a schematically rendered window rail, which is one of the strongest elements in the composition. When you go upstairs and see the painting, this is really striking, this line cutting across the canvas, and is, I think, the strongest compositional element in the painting. And then with the end, or the butt of his brush, you can see that Fragonard has sort of dug into the paint and scratched into it as a means of strengthening this division between us and the sitter. Much of the artist's focus, you'll see this when you go upstairs, is on this really divine yellow-clad arm, held in place, seeming sort of locked in place by this poof of what I think is her skirt fabric, sort of poofing up here, but it's locking that elbow into place. Her left hand, as you can see, sort of disappears over the edge of this chair rail and seems quite unfinished in some ways and just sort of trails off there. And I think this is interesting because to me it seems to avoid any suggestion of the young girl touching herself. So this arm is staying very clearly locked into place. This heightens the painting's focus, and we could even say its insistence on reading as an activity of innocent self-improvement and focused attention. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my thoughts on this painting. And now I look forward to hearing new insights about young girl reading from our two speakers today, Yuriko Jackall and Marika Knowles.
Thank you so much, Cassandra, for that introduction. Thanks to you and Edouard for the invitation to speak here about Fragonard and young girl reading. The painting currently on view at the Fogg Art Museum does not arguably exude the joyful cheekiness of The Swing, the work that Cassandra showed you a little bit earlier. But it is undoubtedly the most well-known and loved of the 18th century French paintings at the National Gallery of Art. As a gift of one of the museum's primary benefactresses, Elsa Mellon Bruce, in honor of her father, Andrew Mellon, it holds a sentimental place in the public's affection. And beyond this historical resonance, it is quite simply delightful. A natural and straightforward depiction of a young woman absorbed in a book, her downcast gaze demure and contemplative, the bright tonalities of her dress in appealing contrast with the violet ribbons that tie up her hair. Apparently, its power to fascinate is long-standing. When it appeared for the first time in public at an auction held in Paris in 1776, the French draftsman Gabriel de Saint-Aubin deemed it fetching enough to reproduce it in the margins of his copy of the sales catalogue. The text of that 1776 catalogue, as Cassandra noted, characterized the work as, I quote, "A young lady seated near a window. She is propped against a cushion and holds a book that seems to occupy her." As this description suggests, the model does not display the engagement with the viewer that one naturally expects of a portrait, despite the fact that young girl reading, as a half-length representation of a single human figure, is in other respects typical of that genre. We might instead suppose the painting to represent an allegory of study, for the act of reading appears to occupy every ounce of concentration possessed by this oblivious young model. Or perhaps more simply, this is a painting about painting, an opportunity for the artist to show off his technique. Certainly, the prettiness of the girl's doll-like features present a perfect showcase for the artist to feature the alla prima or wet-into-wet brushwork that enlivens the yellow skirt and rose-colored cushion. Indeed, it is partly on the basis of such bold brushwork and sparkling colors that young girl reading has traditionally been associated with the group of paintings commonly referred to as Fragonard's fantasy figures. Here are the fantasy figures as they are known today, and I'll go into the origins of this arresting term a little further along. These 17 portrait-like paintings are united by common visual characteristics. Their execution is extravagant. Loose, impetuous brushstrokes collide and intermingle in layers of wet into wet paint. The brilliant color palettes are rich in bright yellows, roses, and Prussian blues, accented by reds and blacks. Several are painted on canvases of nearly identical dimensions, approximately 65 by 80 centimeters. The preening models all wear masquerade attire, plumed hats, slashed sleeves, ribbons, rosettes, ruffs, capes, oversized jewels, in a style known in the 18th century as à l'espagnole, or Spanish style. Many stand at a windowsill or ledge. Many hold the attribute of an activity or a profession, swords, musical scores, guitars, and so forth. Much ink has been devoted to describing these works and speculating about their origins. Very little is actually known. Scholars have traditionally had some clues at their disposal. And as Cassandra noted, the representation of the guitar-playing man, and so that's this figure here, is signed and dated, and the inscription, Frago 1769, is just barely visible, obviously not in my image, but in front of the actual painting, on the ledge at the lower left of the model. This same date of 1769 is also reiterated in identical labels found on the reverse of this painting and the portrait of the man in blue, so these two together. However, these handwritten notations date to the 19th century, and their testimony is thus rendered somewhat dubious. They describe the paintings as having been completed by Fragonard in 1 hour. And right here, there's a sort of issue with this testimony, because although the loose brushwork does indeed suggest speed and facility, such a feat appears technically unlikely. These labels also identify the two paintings in question as portraits of Jean-Claude Richard, Abbé de Saint-Nom, one of Fragonard's most devoted patrons, and his brother, Louis Richard de la Bretèche. So this is Louis Richard de la Bretèche, and this is Saint-Nom. This brings us to the crux of our problem, for one of the major debates surrounding the fantasy figures has historically been whether or not these fanciful representations of costumed individuals are, in fact, portraits. And in using the term portraits, what I mean here is someone who has paid for an accurate representation of him or herself. So a patron who's commissioned a portrait from a model, and not a model who is painting a sort of more unidentified sitter, just for the act of painting or for an allegorical representation. So some of the fantasy figures have always been considered portraits, and similarly, the representation of the man in a broad white collar turning away from a manuscript, this figure here, was long thought to be the distinguished French Enlightenment philosopher Denis Diderot, captured in a moment of inspired contemplation. So a couple of portraits in this group. At the same time, no original source material proves these points. There is no evidence that anyone wrote about the paintings or commissioned them, or that they were even exhibited in Fragonard's lifetime. And with this in mind, the question inevitably arises: what self-respecting collector of the 18th century would place a portrait commission with Fragonard, who was not particularly known as a portraitist, knowing that the outcome would be unconventional to say the least, heavy on virtuoso brushwork and light on representational detail? Undoubtedly, with this in mind, some of the paintings have always been considered, therefore, as allegorical representations or character types. So the singer, the actor, and so forth, and never as portraits. The designation traditionally assigned to this group creates further ambiguity. Figure de fantaisie, fantasy figures, sometimes portrait de fantaisie, or fantasy portraits. The term itself was only formally applied in 1960 by the art historian Georges Wildenstein, who explained that it was singularly appropriate to, I quote, works in which the expression of the face is not stressed, probably a reference to Fragonard's gestural manner of painting. On one level, Wildenstein's melodic term is quite fitting because it also references the fantasy or fancy dress worn by the sitters. But the designation is historically confused because the terms tête de fantaisie and portrait de fantaisie both existed and were used in the 18th century, although not for these works, where they were applied to describe representations of figures often shown in fancy dress, issuing from the realm of the artist's imagination. Other descriptive monikers were used for similar works, including tête d'étude, head study, or tête de vieillard, head of an old man, and I would argue that the latter is the appropriate term to describe the heads undertaken by Fragonard himself, including the example shown by Cassandra from the Musée Jacques Morandre. Ultimately, these issues of nomenclature remind us that the slippage between portrait and genre painting or allegory is never very far away. It also illustrates the degree to which the fantasy figures as a whole constitute a confusing and deceptive group of works. In many respects, Young Girl Reading fits seamlessly into this ensemble. Its model sits at a windowsill, she holds a book, her brightly colored dress with its old-fashioned ruff and fitted white cuffs are painted with characteristic flair. But her attire is simpler than that seen elsewhere. She lacks the oversized pearl beads and feathers of other paintings in the group. Moreover, the other models are all shown more or less facing forward. If they don't look at us, they seem at least to be posing self-consciously, even performatively. In contrast, the central figure in Young Girl Reading is absorbed and remote. Here matters remained until 2012, when a now famous drawing was discovered at auction in Paris. Specialists now accept this sheet as an autographed work by Fragonard himself. This drawing has since disappeared into another private collection, but for scholars of 18th century French painting, its discovery was nothing short of momentous. The sheet shows 3 rows of thumbnail-sized sketches, 18 small drawings in total. The first 2 lines, and so this line and then the one underneath it, contains 7 thumbnail sketches each. The last row contains only 4 such sketches, 2 in ink and then 2 seen very faintly here in graphite. Many of these quickly rendered little designs were immediately recognizable to scholars as corresponding to one or another known painting by Fragonard. Here is a detail of one such sketch, juxtaposed against its associated painting, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. As we can see, fundamental elements of the painted composition are roughly laid out in shorthand, quickly rendered fashion. On the basis of such comparisons, no less than 14 identifications were made, all as paintings now described as fantasy figures. The drawing also contains some unexpected information. First, certain works not previously identified as fantasy figures appeared on the sheet, indicating that they too were somehow associated with this group. So on the right of my slide, on my right, the representation of a cavalier with his horse in the background, now at the Museum of Fine Arts of Barcelona, is unusual because it is the only full-length figure in the series. And then the Vestal is the only oval painting of the series. Other works, long thought to be integral members of the fantasy figure ensemble, were surprisingly omitted. Still, other sketches correspond to paintings that are currently unknown. And finally, all but one of the thumbnail sketches are completed with scribbled annotations, apparently shorthand references to sitters or patrons. In one juxtaposition of a painting with its sketch, it is clear that the written name reads S-nom, which must correspond to Saint-Nom, as in the Abbé de Saint-Nom, Fragonard's aforementioned patron. Some of these annotations appear to be abbreviated or to correspond to very common surnames, and their meanings have yet to be deciphered. But scholars have been able to discern enough to understand that certain paintings, long taken to be iconic effigies of particular individuals, are of different people altogether, leading to debaptisms of the first order. This was most dramatically seen in the pages of the French daily Le Figaro, where it was declared that the figure formerly considered to represent Diderot had suffered from a long-term case of mistaken identity. One thing is clear nonetheless. The presence of these annotated names strongly suggests that the fantasy figures actually do correspond to portraits. The quest for names and the meanings we might give the sheet on this basis have sparked several distinguished inquiries that are still ongoing, and that will indelibly shape future Fragonard scholarship by populating his social and professional networks with hitherto unknown sitters and patrons. For our purposes, as I use the term fantasy figures henceforth, I'm referring to the fancy dress aspect of the figures and not, therefore, to the 18th century term designating an unidentified model. At the National Gallery, the discovery of the drawing also had a transformative impact. It was quickly evident that young girl reading is identifiable with the first sketch on the top row of the sheet. However, a close-up comparison of our painting and its corresponding drawing reveals some discrepancies. For in the drawing, the girl does not appear to be reading at all. Rather, she turns her head, we think, to look out at the spectator in the manner of all of the other fantasy figures who engage with the audience directly. And so we see these two dots here, which might correspond to eyes looking outwards, and then a trace for a nose. And there's a little sort of gesture to the ruffle around her neck. On this basis, other questions naturally follow. Does the sketch correspond to a previous version of the painting? Or was it a vestige of the artist's creative process, representing an imagined composition that was never fully realized in painted form? Thus began a long-term investigation of young girl reading, conducted as a collaborative effort between myself and two colleagues at the gallery, Michael Swicklick of the gallery's Paintings Conservation Department and John Delaney of our Imaging Science Department. It quickly became clear that another composition does indeed exist in the paint layers beneath young girl reading. Using hyperspectral imaging, we were able to recuperate this composition as a representation of a woman holding a book, head turned outwards, wearing a large plumed headdress. And so this image here is a hyperspectral image, and you can sort of faintly see the outwardly turned head, which is then reinforced. This is an image that is an overlay of an X-ray of the painting with the hyperspectral image, and here the outwardly turned head is more clear. And then this plumed headdress that I'm talking about appears over her head and behind her in this sort of dark stippled mass that you can see in the hyperspectral image. And today the plume is visible texturally in the painting still. You can see it if you look at the painting in raking light. And so you might all go upstairs, and if you sort of crouch down underneath the painting and look at it sideways, you can see that there's this massive brush strokes that seem to designate a plumed headdress. From there, our project had two major objectives: to identify the painterly alterations that produced young girl reading in its current state, and to determine the time frame for these alterations. It became clear that the alteration of the head was accomplished with an economy of effort, and this is interesting. While Fragonard rotated the head, showing it in profile rather than at a 3/4 angle, the contours of the new head are positioned around and over those of the first one. The initial eyes are subsumed into the hair of the model of young girl reading. The original face is obscured by the ear of the second girl. And so again, if you look closely at the painting as it is today, you can see that there are two dark spots on either side of her current ear, and those correspond to the eyes of the original model. And then one reason that there's this, so that you can see this very prominent white mark in the middle of the face of the former model, and that corresponds to the ear of the girl today. One thing that's interesting to note is that the current head, the longer you look at it, appears proportionally too small, and the neck is slightly too long. And so you can see that the neck is actually, in profile, it's quite elongated, and the body, the more you look at it, is actually a bit more robust than might be suggested by such a delicate profile. So this might suggest that it was the underlying face that was better adapted to the body, and might, by extension, suggest that the artist pragmatically reused the entire body of his first model, so that the change in the painting that we're discussing really comes from the head, from the shoulders up, and this part is all original to the first painting. The costume was also modified in key respects, the most dramatic of which, of course, was the painting out of the large feather headdress. In addition, elemental scanning reveals dots of mercury. So these are three different elemental scans, white lead, iron oxide, and then on the end, mercury. And the elemental maps basically reveal the concentration of different elements throughout the canvas. And because different pigments have different concentrations of elements, we can sort of gauge more or less where those pigments were concentrated. So one thing that's quite interesting is that in the mercury map, the furthest from me, there are some little dots, basically that are in the headdress, and that might imply that there were dots of vermilion throughout the former feather. These are sort of bead-shaped dots that might possibly suggest that Fragonard had adorned the headdress with beads, similar to some of the other fantasy figures, the other female fantasy figures that we saw earlier. The second goal was to ascertain the status of these altered elements of the composition. Did Fragonard make his modifications in the course of routine reworking of an unsatisfactory composition, or might there be a more complicated explanation? We know, of course, that the painting was changed by 1776, when its presence at auction was recorded by Saint-Aubin. But this does not mean that Fragonard did not consider the first composition a finished work. And on the contrary, I would argue that the evident disproportion between the original body and the current head suggests that his changes did not necessarily improve the painting, or were not necessarily made willingly. A cross-section taken from the area behind the model's head, so the site of the former feather, was examined in the hopes of narrowing the window of time that had elapsed before the composition was changed to its present state. So this sample is composed of a thick stratum of brownish-red lake, so that's this layer here. This shows us that the feather was this color, basically red, and it's under what we now see today. So this is the layer that is now visible to the eye, which is the background behind her head. And that's a layer of white lead and iron oxides. These layers are extremely well differentiated. Under magnification, as I show you here, there's no indication that pigment models from their respective layers mixed, which is an indication, of course, that the red lake layer was dry before the upper layer was applied. Because red lake is a very slow drying pigment, and because, as you can see, it is very thickly applied, we estimate that it would have required at a minimum 6 months, but probably closer to a year, to dry to the point that application of the more quick drying lead layer would have caused only sort of very slight wrinkling, as you can see here, and not cracking, which would be visible to the naked eye today. We also note that Fragonard adapted his technique when he revisited his work. He did not simply scrape off the underlying face, which would have been another way to approach his repainting the work. And doubtless this is because the existing layers were too dry to be disrupted. Instead, he accomplished his new painting in discrete stages. Examination under the microscope suggests that the original features were blocked out with a pinkish layer of paint. At a later moment, after a second drying period, the second painting was accomplished. Fragonard's concern that the original face not showed through may be inferred from his choice of pigments. Elemental mapping indicates a high incidence of opaque iron-based pigments in the features of the second model. And in fact, this recalls standard advice dispensed in the 18th century for how to repaint a work to which the considered final touches had already been applied. We might therefore think that Fragonard believed himself to have put the final touches on his original painting. And certainly the ample incidence of slow-drying lakes throughout the first painting suggests that he did not anticipate changing it. It follows that the painting underlying Young Girl Reading was fully realized. And so this is the suggestion that we make in an article that we published, that we might see this painting as a fully fledged member of the Fantasy Figure series. And with that article, we published, rather tongue-in-cheek, a simulation of what that original painting might have looked like with the red feather layer, the red feather headdress over her head. Once it became clear that the National Gallery of Art possessed a fantasy figure, or close, there was a real institutional enthusiasm for moving forward with a focused exhibition of these paintings, bringing together ours with as many related works as possible. And so this is the exhibition scheduled to open at the gallery this fall. In the 2-year lead up to the exhibition, my colleagues and I have undertaken continued technical examination of the fantasy figures in the hopes of better understanding their interrelationships. Our findings are presented in the forthcoming exhibition catalog, although I should state at the outset that much work remains to be done, and it has always been our goal that the exhibition serve in some sense as a forum within which to present new information and to further discussion rather than as its endpoint. To finish today with one final thought, as we move forward, as I have said, with a firm conviction that the models of the fantasy figures were identifiable individuals. But we still grapple with the issue of what Fragonard, the non-portraitist, attempted to accomplish in the fantasy figures, a group of portraits that simultaneously embrace and defy artistic standards of resemblance. In this context, it is worth noting that the paintings universally appear to belong to a specific space. Notice that the light comes from the left in each composition. Notice that the items of clothing appear curiously interchangeable. We see the same cloaks, doublets, ruffs, and leather gauntlets from one painting to another. Perhaps Fragonard's figures, whoever they were, stood in the same light, wearing the same studio props, those selected by the artist himself in his own studio space. In this case, these unconventional portraits, painted in the heart of his atelier, certainly reflect as much about the artist himself, his working practice, and his artistic aspirations as about any one of his newly identified sitters. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Cassandra and Edouard, for inviting me to speak today. About this marvelous painting that I actually lived in DC till I was 13, so I often went to see this painting at the National Gallery, where I believed that it was by Renoir for a long time. So what I want to do is to start today by showing you a history painting by Fragonard. So starting a little bit earlier in his career in 1765. And I want to use this opportunity to explore some themes in this history painting that I think we can also see in the fantasy figures. So history painting, as Cassandra mentioned, was considered the most elevated genre. It was the most prestigious genre to paint in, and many artists attempted to do so. This was Fragonard's first real effort in the genre, and it was exhibited at the Parisian Salon in 1765. And what it depicts is a scene taken from Greek history, so a very sort of ancient history by Pausanias, and it shows the priest of Dionysus, Coresus, and this young woman, Cariroe, who is a young woman who lives in Coresus's village. And what has happened is that Coresus has fallen madly in love with her. She refused his love, and Dionysus, who becomes very angry, makes everybody in the village go insane. So there's a frenzy of madness in the village, and the only way Dionysus declares that the madness will be lifted is if the young woman is sacrificed. So they take her to the altar here that you see, and it's the priest who's fallen in love with her who's supposed to sacrifice her. But instead, he, at the last moment, kills himself because he can't bear to kill the woman who he loves. So this is a very dramatic scene. It's very typical of the kinds of scenes that were supposed to be picked for history painting. And it's also the last history painting that Fragonard really attempted. So it's very curious to many scholars that Fragonard had such a success in this genre, but that he then chose to stop painting in this genre. But some of the themes that I think carry over and that I'd like to talk about today in the fantasy figures are, first of all, perhaps not really a theme, but a manner of presentation, and that's the theatrical presentation. You can see that he really stages this as if it's on a stage. This is our sort of proscenium here. There's this dramatic sort of theatrical lighting, and it's a moment of high drama, a theatrical gesture undertaken by the priest. The other thing that I think is interesting is that this entire scene is spurred by the love for a woman, and there's a kind of way that the female figure here, with her breasts exposed, is at the heart of the sort of disorder that has taken over this town, and that has led to the ultimate act of disorder or inversion, which is that the sacrificial victim isn't even killed. The person who was supposed to execute the victim becomes the person killing himself. So there's this inversion of roles, and it's all related to a kind of disruptive feminine energy. And the rococo style in which Fragonard worked was often associated with a sort of a feminine, it was called a feminine style, and it was attributed to women's tastes and also to a certain kind of feminine creative energy. And I think that that carries over beautifully in the fantasy portraits. So that even while Fragonard might have ceased working as a history painter, he carried over some of these interests into his work in the fantasy portraits. And just to show you a couple of my favorite examples of the fantasy pictures, both from the Louvre, the first thing to note is how, and Cassandra was nice enough in order to sort of suggest to me that this is something that needs to be kind of clarified, is how are these theatrical? Why do sort of we read them as theatrical? And I think that one of the major ways that they're theatrical, of course, is first of all in the theatrical pose that's struck by the figures. And I'm showing you here a fantasy figure, a drawing by Antoine Watteau here of an actor posing, and then, of course, Corésus from Fragonard's picture. And just to give you a sense of the kind of, all these figures have this sense of sort of dramatic flair, a sense of kind of exuberance, a self-consciousness in the way that they're presenting themselves to the viewer that has a certain kind of theatrical atmosphere to it. The other way in which they're theatrical is what was mentioned earlier, Spanish dress. And Spanish dress was a kind of, it wasn't actually derived from contemporary Spanish dress. It referred sort of very vaguely to what the kind of Spanish costume that had been worn during the 17th century. And it was associated with the figure of Don Quixote, and who had been written about by Cervantes in his sort of comic epic novel. And what you have here is an early 18th century painting of a performance of Don Quixote, a French painting. And you see the woman is wearing the Spanish dress with the ruff, and so is the Don Quixote figure, this kind of loose ruff. So you can see those sort of theatrical elements. This is a play, and the very kind of loose adaptation that Fragonard makes of this dress. He doesn't show us all the kinds of marvelous details that we have in Coipel's painting. He generalizes it. But the final way in which the paintings are theatrical and that I want to emphasize today is the performance of brushstroke. We've had a lot, Cassandra and Yuriko have both mentioned the incredible brushwork that we see in these paintings, very visible brushwork, very expressive brushwork, a kind of brushwork that's sometimes referred to as being unfinished, non fini, non finito. And of course, that doesn't mean that the painting itself is unfinished, but that the brushwork is done in an unfinished style. Now, why is loose brushwork, unfinished brushwork considered theatrical? It's considered theatrical because through this brushstroke, Fragonard performs various identities for himself. There were various identities that were associated with loose brushwork. And the first of these identities was the identity of the courtier, or the nobleman. And I'm showing you another painting by the 18th century artist Antoine Watteau, a small painting that's at the Louvre, of a man called the Indifferent One, l'Indifférent. And this painting is taken to be the sort of ultimate illustration of the courtly sort of affect. This figure he's associated with something in Italian, it's called sprezzatura. It was translated in French as negligence. And it refers to a kind of a sort of the ability to make very difficult things look easy, as if this man is performing this pose with a kind of indifference. He doesn't care at all what we think. This is a very balletic pose. Of course, it's probably a tough pose to actually hold if you tried to do it, but he's doing it easily, and he's indifferent to this pose. He's so naturally kind of elegant and courtly. And so that was one of the first associations of loose brushstroke, that Fragonard was able to very quickly paint this, easily paint it, and that it looked so elegant and so wonderful that he was painting in the same way that a courtier performed his sort of grace and elegance as a dancer. And then the second association of loose brushwork and the kind of identity that might be performed by loose brushwork was that of the man of genius, the homme de génie. And I'm showing you the fantasy figure that was previously thought to be Diderot, because Denis Diderot was an example of the Enlightenment man of genius, the philosophe. And this kind of genius that Diderot was thought to have was thought to be a sort of, it was referred to as enthusiasm, excitement, a kind of ebullience, as if sort of philosophical genius was its own kind of energetic current of sorts. And so Fragonard is able to translate that sense of kind of genius and excitement into the way that he paints this sort of figure. So he uses that very visible brushstroke right here to give him the kind of light that's on his forehead to allude to his intellectual radiance. And you know, this is probably one of the most exciting paintings you'll ever see of someone studying, right? It's a very kind of dynamic treatment of something that we think of as static. So Fragonard is using his brushwork to energize this picture of a scholar working. Now, the final feature of brushwork that I want to talk about is actually the idea of beautiful disorder. And that's the title of my paper today, Disorderly Beauty. And I'm showing you again the painting that Cassandra showed you earlier, two paintings by Boucher, Madame Boucher in her boudoir, and another one, woman fastening her garter. Her maid is here in this painting. She has a little cat here. And the aesthetic that Boucher was pursuing in these paintings, it's not just about, it's not really actually supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be a form of beautiful disorder, that these women are, that they've sort of strewn their possessions around them in a negligent way that's kind of creating a sense of beauty and grace and creativity, showing ultimately a kind of creativity. And of course, I always try to explain to my husband that this is what I'm doing as well when I sort of throw my books and knitting needles all over the place. But this is the kind of aesthetic that's being pursued. And this was the other thing that the loose kind of brushwork that Fragonard is pursuing is articulating. It's articulating this theme of beautiful disorder that was associated with women, with women's ways of organizing their environments. And I've always thought that this is that's kind of one of the themes of this particular fantasy figure, the one at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You see there's generally animals in these interiors, so the women also had little animals kind of running around. Here she's got her dog. The beautiful ribbon of a leash is quite sort of disordered. And then you can also, of course, see all these elements of kind of almost this sort of performance of careless brushwork that we can also tie to this idea of feminine disorder. And that kind of, just to show you another example of Fragonard, inspired by a female subject working with incredibly loose, very sensual brushstroke. And the other association of the loose brushwork, of course, is with touch. That Fragonard is kind of almost touching his model, experiencing his model at the same time that he's applying his brush to the canvas. And it's also an association with natural, the energy of nature. So this is a nude scene, a scene that has quite a bit of foliage in it as well. And also female bodies. Again, another sort of standard association of the women's body with nature in the 18th century. And I wanted to show you as well another painting by Boucher to show you that this idea of beautiful disorder, it wasn't just about women who were at home, sort of just, it wasn't about little ordinary bourgeois women, it was also about very important, very courtly women and women who were also creative. And this is Boucher's portrait of Madame de Pompadour, the very famous mistress of Louis XV. And Madame de Pompadour was very well educated and was a great supporter of the arts and of Enlightenment philosophers like Diderot. And you can see her here. This is her beautifully disordered interior at Versailles. And you see here she's got her desk, right, with the kind of the letter strewn about. This is some sealing wax. And then she has a volume of prints. I think this is a volume of prints here that she's actually made herself. She was also a printmaker. And then here in the back, she has a library with the Encyclopédie, which was an important compendium of an encyclopedia of the world that was organized by the Enlightenment philosophe. So a couple of details from this. Here's her little dog, again, the little animal with its fluffy ears, the roses, the pen or geometrical instrument, more scrolls, more prints. So everything's kind of disordered, but it's also a sign of her her intellectual ease. And I'm bringing you back here to that first image I showed of the woman being sacrificed, to kind of attempt to draw a parallel between these visions of sort of feminine creativity as a kind of disorder, and the other kind of disorder that we see here, where a woman has caused a sort of social disorder in the town in which she lives. And Pompadour was also accused, of course, of being a source of disorder. Many people thought that she was a bad influence on the king. She was from a bourgeois background, not from a courtly background, and so her entire sort of presence was considered to be reversing things, putting things in the wrong hierarchical order. And of course, the painting that has been traded, the reason why we have the beautiful girl reading here at Harvard is because we traded this wonderful portrait of Madame de Pompadour, which is really an ode to her artistic creativity. She's wearing here this beautiful cameo of Louis XV that she in fact designed herself. And it's not quite as messy as we have here, but she's got her cosmetics kind of strewn about her dressing table, her little powder puff here, and of course, she's painting herself. She's in the act of applying her blush, and this is a bit like a painter's brush, and many art historians have talked about the parallels between Pompadour painting herself and Boucher painting her. So that's a bit of my attempt to kind of pull those two the paintings that have been traded for each other back together as having some of this through Fragonard's brushstroke, the creativity of his brushstroke, the sort of beautiful disorder of this expressive brushstroke that we get, particularly in this area. He's alluding to these certain ideas of feminine creativity. And then finally, just to close, this idea of the disorderly woman, it wraps up sort of nicely with this 19th century painting by Manet of a woman reading the journal, the newspaper, but of course she's not really reading, she's pretending to read while she's watching what's going on in the cafe around her. So she's using reading as a pretense to sort of spy on people and be a little bit naughty or disorderly. And so that's just a 19th century kind of legacy of Fragonard's painting. So thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Yes. So before we start our brief discussion, I just wanted to say how much sense it makes for us to have this painting. Not only because we have a really wonderful collection of works by Fragonard at the museum, paintings, but particularly drawings, some of which are on view on the second floor, and more are accessible in our Art Study Center by appointment. So I really urge you. We, for instance, have one of two sketchbooks by Fragonard that survive in our collection. It's also it also makes much sense for us to have this event here because in 1979 there was a landmark exhibition on Fragonard, and I'm showing you the slightly discolored cover of the catalogue. This exhibition was curated by a former curator of this museum, Eunice Williams, who's really a reigning expert on the artist still today, and who unfortunately couldn't be here today. So thank you, Marika, Cassandra, and Yuriko for these very interesting talks, which really show us the wide range of questions that these most interesting pictures raise. And as you can see, despite the most recent advances in scholarship, these fantasy figures are still elusive in terms of their meaning, but also their status. And I think some questions are still very much open. Yuriko, you seem to believe that the young girl reading is indeed a portrait, although when we look at that drawing that emerged in 2012, this is probably the only one or one of the few that do not have a name inscribed underneath. I don't know if you could speak to that.
Thank you, Edouard. Thank you. Is this working?
Yes, it is working.
Okay. So as Edouard points out, the drawing that I showed in my talk has small abbreviated inscriptions under all of the sketches except for Young Girl Reading, which is also the only painting in the entire group that was changed so significantly. And one possible explanation might be that the, by the time Fragonard made this drawing, he did not consider Young Girl Reading to be a portrait any longer. It might suggest that the change had already been made to the painting. I would argue that the underlying composition is more the portrait, looking out, engaging with the spectator, and the one that we see here, or the one that we see in profile, is really more of sort of an allegory or a genre painting, and that this had already happened before Fragonard made his drawing, and so he's including Young Girl Reading still in the drawing, maybe sort of remembering what she had been, but that there was no longer a need to apply a name. That's one possibility. But it's true that it is a real, there are so many questions that still continue to sort of plague this series, and that certainly is one of them. Yeah.
And also, sorry, as a drawing curator, I can't help myself but say a few things about the drawing, which really, it's unclear what this drawing is, what function it had. And I don't know if you could just briefly give us a summary of what the different scholarly opinions are. Is it before, after?
So there's been a great deal of debate about this very subject, and that's still ongoing. And basically, there are a couple of interpretations that have kind of been advanced, and it's sort of our hope that maybe bringing the paintings together and seeing them together will add at least to this debate, if not, bring us all of the answers that we're hoping for. But basically, so one possibility is that the drawing that's on the screen might be a Fragonard recording the paintings before they left his studio. So, kind of souvenir to remember them by. One of the problems with that interpretation is, of course, that this means that he would be looking at the paintings. And there are, although Young Girl Reading is the only one that's so kind of prominently changed, there are little differences between the paintings as we know them today and the drawing. So, for instance, one of the best examples is the figure of Saint-Non, the first drawing on the second row. you see that the ledge kind of ends, the ledge on which he's resting his hand ends halfway through the little composition, but in the actual painting, it runs along the bottom of the canvas. So if he was really looking at the paintings, why would there be these differences? Or, does that mean that he was doing the drawing kind of as he was doing the paintings? Another suggestion is that the drawing was done significantly after the paintings had all left his studio and kind of, left his life, and maybe he's remembering them, trying to make some kind of inventory or list of what he had done, and that in that case it would be a project that was very personal, and maybe one that he, because just for him, he didn't need to be so accurate. It's very quickly drawn. It's obviously kind of, it's a drawing that has suffered, and not just, in the 19th century after Fragonard's death. It seems that it was possibly folded up and maybe carried around in someone's pocket. So, does that imply that he was just making it for himself? Another possibility, and this is one that's quite intriguing, is that the drawing might represent a plan for an installation of these paintings in a common space, like some kind of gallery. And according to that idea, each row of paintings would correspond to a different wall in a gallery. So two facing walls of paintings, basically. And that is a very seductive idea, obviously. Some of the sort of issues that have been raised with it are that the paintings that are shown side by side don't necessarily, might not necessarily look very well. The compositions, are very repetitive, and there are instances in which you have paintings, or instances in which, according to this installation plan, you would have paintings that are turning their backs one to another, which, of course, is every exhibition architect's nightmare. So. It's it's so difficult because there are kind of pros and cons to all of these possibilities. I may be forgetting some of the other things that have been suggested. I don't know, Edouard, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think that these are the main. I should just say that, personally, I don't believe that a drawing like this, that Fragonard would have worked in a way that this would have been a kind of blueprint for the whole series. How would you know that such and such would accept to be your sitters? That's quite difficult. Then, as recorded, in other words, as records, they're fairly unusual. I mean, they're more summary than records. Records in the 18th century can be either, fairly precise drawings, but also there are instances of oil sketches. And what better way to do a quick record of an oil painting than to paint an oil sketch? So that's why I don't know if Marika and Cassandra, you have any thoughts on that? So.
Well, I wondered, Yuriko, how you guys felt at the National Gallery when the sketch emerged and when your painting was the only one without a name attached. Was that a sort of positive? Was there a lot of disappointment? Did it fit with your feeling about what the painting was in relation to these other ones that we've talked about?
Well, initially, I think we were a bit sad. Of course, it would have been wonderful to know a little more about Fragonard's intentions as he was making this work. One thing I will say is that it seems that our painting is the most, certainly there's this change, but then other aspects of the painting also are different from what you see further along. It's the only one where even if they're, even with this change, it's the only one where she has her back to a wall. It's been quite worked in the background, and I think that there's as you start looking at this in comparison with some of the later ones, even if she had her head turned outwards, I think that there's a staticness about our work that sets it apart no matter what, and that kind of makes you think, given the fact that the sketch for our painting is the first one on the end of a row, you might imagine that it was sort of a initial, like a trial or a kind of portrait type where he's trying to work out how to place his sitter on a canvas of this size. And then as he starts, feeling really comfortable with it, he goes on and sort of perfects his portrait type in other paintings. It's interesting that all of the figures basically are on canvases of identical size. And so maybe it's really, he's trying to kind of perfect a portrait type and then he moves on, which, of course we can say that makes our painting just as special in a way.
First, it could be the first. I mean, to me, that seems quite compelling, actually, that it, was sort of the beginning of the series in some way.
Before we open it to the floor, I had a question for Marika. I was really interested and convinced by your argument about the sort of performative theatrical nature of these pictures. But I wondered whether we couldn't look at them in connection with the 18th century notion of wit, esprit, which is really crucial at that time. And I don't know if you could speak to that.
Yeah, sure. I think that the idea of esprit is sort of, it's a kind of particular, it's usually explained as a particular kind of French wit, sort of different kinds of wordplay, but also associated with fantasy and caprice and all these kinds of a sort of light humor that's also quite sort of difficult and intellectual and has a lot of the features of sort of sprezzatura. And it's not easy to be witty, but it has to seem witty. You can never practice your jokes in advance, for example, or it can never seem like you practice your jokes in advance. I think that we definitely see that we can definitely add elements of esprit to the characterization of what Fragonard is trying to do with his brushwork. To perform any kind of virtuosic performance can be tied to elements of wit, I think. And I also think that if we take, I think that no matter the discovery of the drawing, I'm not a Fragonard specialist, but the discovery of the drawing with the names attached to it, to me, doesn't really change my understanding of the paintings, even if there were subjects. I think that the most that different sitters could have done is inspire him to sort of wittily perform on the motif of a certain sitter's features. So we can think of the kind of elaborations that he made to the appearance of any individual as a performance of wit in a way.
And if I may say, wit normally is quite fast, and so is Fragonard when he paints. So now it's high time for questions from you.
Thank you so much. It was a very interesting presentations. And I had never seen the painting before, so it's an eye opener. Was there a reference that this girl was Fragonard's sister-in-law? Or no, sorry. Yes, his wife's sister. Is that correct?
So Fragonard did. He knew his wife's sister and he worked with her. So this is more a question for Cassandra because there is a painting that was done by both of them. There are two paintings done by both of them in this collection.
So, thank you for asking me to be a little bit more clear about something that I've just been sort of experimenting with in my computer in my head. To me, it just seems possible that it could potentially be a portrait of Fragonard's wife because it's around the same time that he marries her. And why would he need to put a label on the drawing that lists the name of his own wife? So, but that's highly speculative. And what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So this is just something that I've been thinking about and certainly looking at the drawing. And then there are other drawings that are said by scholars to be his wife and his wife's sister. Yes, that's something that I have been wondering myself whether this could, but this is not something that, as far as I know, may be discussed by other scholars. I don't know, but
It hasn't really been discussed by other scholars, but it's true that it makes sense. First of all, there's no name, but then also that he would, if this idea of trying to perfect a portrait technique before embarking on portraits of paying sitters is to be believed.
She would be there. She would
right
be in the
there.
studio. So so it is it's an idea, but that was yes.
The change makes her look much more demure and pretty also. So I just wonder if she had any opinion about the first.
Well, that's definitely one possibility why the painting was changed in the first place. The original sitter, if there was one, didn't like her painting, and so he, didn't want to buy it ultimately, and so Fragonard was left with this painting that was basically unsellable because it was a portrait of a known person, and so he then could have transformed it into what it is today, which of course then did come out on the art market in the 1770s.
Sorry, what I found striking when looking at your incredible imagery is that the underlying face is more massive, right? It seems it's more, and it didn't lead to one of your predecessors in the 80s to write that, or to think that it could have been a man?
Yeah, so because, so in the 80s, there was an X-ray was taken of our painting, and it was, so in the X-ray you can see, that there's something underneath the current face. And because of the high content of white lead in the original face, it showed through in the X-ray as being, extremely sort of these very strong features, very masculine. And so the thought was that he might have started painting ahead of a man and then, repainted the entire canvas with this young woman. And one of the things that was interesting in our study was finding, yes, as we looked at it more and more, we started seeing that the body that we currently have is, sort of a more, maybe a little more robust than the head, which is, this very delicate little head, and they don't necessarily correspond. I mean, he's such a great painter that he made it work, but the neck is quite long. And one thing that I didn't get into is that he actually seems to have enlarged the ruff when he was making these adjustments to the costume in order to kind of cover a little bit the fact that the neck is so long. And he put these violet ribbons behind her neck to sort of hide it, because otherwise I think it would have been much more obvious.
So I think we have time for one last question. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I was just kind of interested because the last couple of years, Fragonard has gotten a lot more scholarship and publications, especially with the Met last year doing Drawing Triumphant, and then the year before at the Musée du Luxembourg, the Fragonard Amour Galant. So I was just wondering why you think there's been such an influx in the past couple of years in kind of wanting to present on him, since he's an enigmatic figure as well as has a prolific use of, lovers, fantasy figures, drawings, prints, engravings, so.
I'd love to hear what Yuriko has to say about this, and also Marika. I mean, there was an anniversary. Wasn't there an anniversary of his birth or death maybe 4 or 5 years ago that I think...
In 2006. It's actually 11
years. God, that's what happens when you get older. This is like 3 or 4 years ago. So that seemed to spur some scholarship. There was my sense is that there has been an incredible amount of scholarship on Boucher by a generation of really important people looking at his work, and that Fragonard is sort of the next step in some ways. I don't know. It's a really good question, and you could make connections maybe with things that are happening in the art world today, but I don't think I'm the best person to do that, but maybe you guys have.
Yeah, I would just, I mean, my first thought to that is just that there has been, I mean, one of the reasons why I chose to study French art in grad school was because it was right around the time that a ton of really interesting publications were coming out on the Rococo. There was a long time when the Rococo was sort of, you know, career suicide. And it's not that way anymore. In fact, now there are too many people doing it, if that's even possible, which of course it isn't. But But yeah, I think there has been really cool reinterpretations of the Rococo, and particularly the attention to self-referentiality in that period with brushwork. You know, I mean, it's so easy to be like, well, Fragonard's just the first Jackson Pollock, but of course it's very different and much more specific than that, but there is certainly an attraction to that kind of freedom of brushwork.
And I should just to put in a little Harvard plug, which we always have to do here. Ava Locker-Bucharth, who teaches in the History of Art department here at Harvard, couldn't be here because it's summer, so she's in France doing research. But she has a book coming out where Fragonard will be one of the central figures looked at. So keep an eye out for that as well. But yeah, a lot of interest in his work.
Yeah, and there's a kind of new generation. I mean, I would include you, but also people like Marianne Dupuy-Vacher and Perrine Stein at the Met. Should also say that collectors, many collectors in America were actually very impressed by this exhibition, and it inspired them to collect. And if you were lucky enough to see the Fragonard, so drafts, drawing triumphant at the Met a few months ago, you would have seen how much was collected just in the New York area. So there's something about Fragonard in New York. It's a real love story, clearly.
And I would just finish by saying that Fragonard's work is of the highest quality. He's a really remarkable technician. That's something that I've, been lucky enough to really realize, spending so much time with his work in preparing the exhibition project that's going to be coming up in the fall. And I think that there's something incredibly attractive about that level of quality. And in addition to that, the fact that he remains, there are still so many questions, as you can see from this, that surround his work, the chronology of his work. And so he remains really compelling and intriguing. And people really want to work on him because he's just so great.
I mean, one could argue that he's a kind of late bloomer in terms of his critical fortune, because for many years, I remember talking to Eunice, and she would say when she started a PhD on Fragonard that would have been in the 60s, she said, well, no one considered him. They thought he was fluffy, he was like Boucher, but at least Boucher was more well known. And of course, Boucher was, as he was full member of the Academy and so on, whereas Fragonard, and that, he paid the price of that, early on decided that it wasn't for him to be part of the establishment of, the Academy. So I think in the very long run, it's sort of, and in the short term as well, it sort of affected his critical fortune. But I think it's probably time, unfortunately, to end this event. And so I'd really, we'd like to warmly thank our distinguished speakers for their great presentations. We also thank you for coming. And before you go, please make sure to go and see the painting or to see it again. And we all expect you to flock to Washington in a few weeks to see Yuriko's great exhibition. Thank you.